Not Quite Hollywood, the wild, untold story of Ozploitation. Documentary film documents all these incredible genre movies that many people have not seen, many people have seen and love. Directed by Mark Hartley, who's joining me here right now. Mark, thank you for joining me on WKCR.
It's a pleasure. As soon as you mentioned the word documentary, I think people switched off all over the city. So we'll have to make it sound a little bit more exciting than that, I think.
Okay, an action-packed
roller coaster ride that is a rockumentary.
That's if I must say, edited very similar to a music video.
That is true.
Yeah,
yes.
it's so one thing I actually noticed about this movie is that I don't know, the longest time you let someone talk is about 3 sentences. Right?
Really? Who got 3 sentences?
I know, right?
I must have been asleep during that part of the editing process.
Yes, but this movie is literally like, it was crazy, splash, kaboom. No, I never did that, kabow, splam. Like, am I right?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Well, look, we had a limited time. We had a large number of films. I think we show scenes from 100 films in the documentary. We only had 100 minutes, so it wasn't. It also wasn't a documentary that was looking at, the Middle East crisis. It was about wild, crazy gonzo cinema, and it had to have that energy, or it wouldn't have been truthful to the films that it was, celebrating.
Sure. So let's start, I guess, where the movie starts, and so give me just very, very quickly a brief history of Australian cinema, and then how the R rating changed that.
Well, more so than Australian cinema, Australian censorship was really strict in the late 60s. We were like I think the second most heavily censored country in the world.
How about that?
I think the most heavily censored was something like Northern Ireland, and we were just after that. So it was, people of my generation can't comprehend how incredibly strict it was, but I've heard that, reproductions of the Statue of David were banned, and people could be arrested and thrown in jail literally for just holding a copy of Playboy magazine. That's how full on it was, and I'm not exaggerating. They're true stories.
Wow.
So in about 1971, they introduced the R certificate, which meant finally there could be adult content on screen. Up until then, even art house films had all the pubic hair snipped out of them. And suddenly, Australian audiences just went crazy for anything that had any kind of adult content in it, because they'd been, starved of it for so long. And some very smart filmmakers in Australia took full advantage of this and made a couple of cheap and cheerful nudie films, which just set the box office alive. There was a film called Alvin Purple, which cost $200,000 to make back then and grossed $5 million. I think 1 in every 5 Australian had seen it at some point, and it was an R-rated film, so it's quite miraculous. And it kind of took off from there. It was, as they say in the documentary, it was on for young and old after that. And we were getting our industry back on track after it being in the wilderness for so long. People hadn't been making Australian films. And if there'd been any kind of Australian images on screen, the films had been directed by foreigners visiting Australia. So, Australian audiences were starting to see Australian characters on screen, see Australian accents on screen. And because they were inventing the industry from the ground up, there were no rules. And I guess these Australian exploitation films took full advantage of that and just were all about getting the most crazy, insane images possible onto that drive-in screen.
And now you separate the movie into kind of chapters, I guess we can call it. Well, how would you call them?
Yeah, well, they're 3 categories, I guess.
Categories,
yeah.
Okay. And can you tell me about each one, and then maybe some of the prime movies that really fit right into those?
Well, it just seemed easier rather than having this big mesh of all these different kinds of films over 100 minutes that we kind of split them, because it seemed to me that the key personnel, the Ozploitation auteurs, let's call them, really didn't stray that much from the different genres. So we have the in Australia, we have an expression which is ochre, which is like an Australian redneck.
Okay.
So we had our ochre films and our sex films, and I think in the documentary that section's called Ochres, Knockers, Tubes and Pubes. which is pretty self-explanatory when you see the documentary, because it does celebrate a time when the Australian bush was up front and not out back, and there's lots of pubic hair on display. Actually, I can now carbon date films from the amount of pubic hair featured on the women. So that's one skill I did develop making this film. And the second category is our horror and thrillers, and that's Comatose Killers and Outback Chillers. Comatose Killers, because one of the key films of that genre was a film called Patrick, about a guy in a coma with telekinetic powers. And the third section just looks at our action films, and that's was it Kung Fu Masters and I can't think. It's been so long since I watched the film.
Something
Anyway.
that rhymes with masters.
Yeah.
It has to do with exploding cars, maybe car disasters. Well, something like that.
Yeah.
Pretty
Gee,
sure.
That's going to drive me nuts. I'm not going to be able to sleep.
You know what?
If anyone saw the film at a preview, please.
It probably has it right here, but
That's
actually,
all right.
it actually
We'll work it out.
doesn't. But
There was something disasters and Kung Fu Masters. Anyway.
But that deals with all of those how do you call them?
Chop Socky?
Chop socky films.
Well, we only really had one Kung Fu film made in Australia, which is The Man from Hong Kong, but
Right.
it deals with that and all our White Line Fever crazy car movies. Yeah.
Sure.
Of which we excelled, really.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Mad Max is a classic. I mean, actually, there were not a lot of movies featured that I had seen. Of course, I had seen Mad Max, which brings me to another question. Who do you think this documentary is more suited towards? The people who have seen the films, or the people who you want to see the films?
Well, I always assumed that hardly anyone had seen the films. That was kind of one of the interesting things when we went to actually cut this film. It was very different to, say, making a documentary on American genre or English genre, because you assume that most of the people who watch them are going to have some idea about the films that they're seeing on screen. But here I said to the two other editors, no one is going to have a clue about most of these films, so we have to work out how much information we give about these films before we cut to the funny stories. And that was a pretty hard juggling act, information versus entertainment. But it's also, I think, one of the things that people appreciate the documentary. They walk away having discovered something. There's not a lot of film documentaries that you can see that literally introduce films that you have absolutely no idea about. And this is one such documentary that you walk away and hopefully you've got a long list of films that you'd like to track down and see, and you've just been tempted with through some interesting excerpts and sound bites.
A film reviewer.
It's a sampler.
It's a sampler. A film reviewer said, one said it's almost a feature length advertisement for these type of films. Another film reviewer said it's more of a really good TV special than a great movie. How would you respond to that? Do you feel like
obviously those reviews were kept from me?
Did you feel that you almost paid too much homage to these films which you obviously love? I mean, granted, you have these critics, keep on piping it and saying like, this is crap, and then at the same time you'll have the producers being like, oh, we had so much fun, it was so crazy. Do you feel like, perhaps your love was too strong for these?
Not really. I kind of think it's a pretty fair documentary. I think it's a pretty irreverent documentary. It certainly doesn't treat these films like they're all works of genius, because if it did, I would be totally insane. And I think sometimes people, obviously, when you're making, we make fun of a lot of the films. People certainly, if they hate the films, they'll tell you. They're very honest about the films that we're documenting. But there is a great sense of fun about the making of these films.
Oh, yes.
And I think that maybe that's a little bit too infectious, and people walk away thinking that all we're trying to do is talk about how great these films are. But we're not. We're just talking about how great the time was making these films. And I think some people blur that a little bit.
Sure.
And I also think the fact that a lot of the clips, have been chosen for their entertainment value. People walk away thinking, well, maybe we've tried to make the films look too good. So I don't know. I, I, I certainly, whenever people were disparaging about the films, I certainly stuck that in the documentary.
Yeah.
Um, and I, as a filmmaker, certainly don't love all these films, but I couldn't. Um, it wasn't my story. It was the filmmaker's story and the cast and crews of these films' story, and I'm just there to tell it. And if they want to tell funny, interesting stories, and they had a blast and were really affectionate towards these films, well, that's what comes across in the documentary.
Sure, sure. Um, you know,
It's interesting about that TV comment, though, because this
mm,
film did actually start out. I had always planned it as a television series,
hmm,
and we could never raise the money to make it as a television series.
hmm.
And when eventually we kind of got it funded as a feature, it all fell into place then, because we could also then have the money to travel around the world, interview everyone we wanted to, and also remaster all the films within the documentary to look as good as possible, which we probably couldn't have done if it had ended up being a six-part television series.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to talk about that, since you brought it up, how this movie did get off the ground. Now, I understand that Quentin Tarantino was involved. Is that correct?
Well, inadvertently. I mean, we were lucky enough to get an interview with Quentin early on before we'd raised our finance,
Mm-hmm.
and it was having him involved and having a pretty good 4-hour interview with him that helped us. I'm sure that's how we ultimately got the money from our two international distributors from England and America, Magnolia and Optimum, that helped trigger the rest of the finance in Australia. I'm sure that Quentin, proved to them that there was some international some he made it more accessible to international audiences, and I'm sure that helped get it up. I'm honestly, I think if we hadn't have got that interview with Quentin, then this film wouldn't have got made.
Hmm.
But he certainly didn't phone up distributors for us, or open up his wallet and hand me money and say just go and make the film or anything like that. But he was very generous with his time and putting his name to the project. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. One thing I was telling a friend earlier about this film, and what I really like what you did is that there'll be a producer and it'll say blank blank producer. There'll be a director. It'll say blank blank director, and then Quentin Tarantino you just have labeled as fan.
Yeah.
So.
Well, he wasn't a part of the movement, the exploitation movement. He's there purely as a fan.
Yes.
And it was important to have someone who had seen these films outside of Australia to give an overseas perspective, because in Australia, most people didn't hear anything about the success of these films overseas. We heard about Picnic at Hanging Rock getting a standing ovation, on its New York release. What we weren't being told is that it was playing in one cinema in New York, and our kung fu movie, The Man from Hong Kong, was playing down the road in 15.
Mm.
But Quentin was great because he spoke about these films from an American fan's point of view, and also as a filmmaker who had been inspired by these films and had paid homage to them.
Well, let's talk about that. How did he pay homage to him? And also, tell me about when he came to show Australia Kill Bill and what happened there.
I had given up on the project. It was about 5 years into the project, and we just couldn't raise the money. It was just no one was interested in funding us. So I gave up. And then a couple of months after that, I read an interview with Quentin where he spoke about how he had screened the Australian film Road Games, which is featured in the documentary, to the cast and crew on the set of Kill Bill Volume 1. Hmm. And so I had amassed at that point a 100-page research document, and I just tracked down his assistant's email and sent it to him because I thought he'd be interested in reading it. It wasn't about luring him to the project because it was dead in the water at that point. And I got an email back the next day from his assistant that said, Quentin has read your document from cover to cover. What can he do to help you get the project up? Or something like that. So we went over and shot this interview with him, and as I've mentioned, we used that as a calling card, as a pitch document, and that eventually helped us get up. And what was your other question?
What is the story?
His homages. Well, certainly, if you in the documentary, he talks about referencing things like Patrick, the film we talked about, with the guy in the coma with the telekinetic powers in Kill Bill, and certainly anyone who's seen Death Proof will realise that there's a huge scene there lifted from a film called Fair Game, where a girl is strapped to the front of a car and driven through the outback. So yeah, he certainly wears his his influences on his sleeve.
Yes, yes. As a hood ornament, I mean, it's ridiculous and entertaining and extreme, and you, you just
Yeah,
I think he
it's one of those things where you go, who on earth let them do that?
right. What were they thinking? So it begs the question. So you've directed a lot of making ofs in the past, right? Smaller features, right?
Not look. I had a music video background, and then when I decided I'd work hard to get this project up, I thought the easiest way I could do that was by earning a living doing it. So I put together a whole lot of DVD featurettes on classic Australian films, but also on some of these exploitation films too. And I think that ultimately helped the documentary because I got to forge relationships with a lot of the producers and cast. So when we came to interview them for Not Quite Hollywood, they kind of trusted me and were possibly a little bit more open with me than they would be with other people. So that helped. So yeah, I had made a fair few making ofs for DVDs. But yeah, primarily my background was music video production.
Right, as like I said before, definitely comes out in this quick, fast editing and excitement of the film.
I've never thought of myself as a documentary filmmaker, and I'm sure most documentary filmmakers who see the film will think of me in that way as well. And so it was more about bringing my music video aesthetic to the project because I knew that it needed to be a pretty rock and roll journey.
Yeah. Yeah. So why was this what you chose to do as your first film?
I didn't really choose it as my first film. I've had a lot of other projects that I've been trying to get up, but they just never happened. And this was the one that managed to get up after a long time. So, everyone was working on various projects, and this is the one that happened. And, I just launched into it and did it as good as I could. And hopefully, people see it and see some kind of craft there, and I get a chance to do something else.
Now, okay, in this film, there's all these crazy behind the scenes production stories that come out. I mean, stories of stuntmen dying, stories of producers at the horse tracks betting the investment money in an attempt to get more money.
Yeah.
What is perhaps your favorite, craziest behind-the-scenes production story, and maybe you can give us an even more detailed story that is not in the movie, something that's even an even juicier version.
My favourite story in the film is the Dennis Hopper story, which he amazingly tells us. We got to interview Dennis, and we had to remind him slightly of a lot of things that happened to him in Australia because he didn't have all his wits about him when he was in Australia in about 1976. He made a film in Australia called Mad Dog Morgan, which is a bushranger film. You guys know what bushrangers are, don't you?
I mean, if you can explain for our audience.
Outlaws, yeah.
Sure.
And Western outlaws. And on rap, well, let's just say that Dennis was completely drug and alcohol fueled through the entire film and really didn't know what was going on. And on rap, he got onto a horse and drove across a creek bed to an awaiting car, jumped in and sped off to Mad Dog Morgan's grave, the actual grave of the outlaw he was playing. He got incredibly even more drunk and tore up the cemetery, decimated the cemetery, then drove off again with the police in hot pursuit. They eventually pulled him over. He was still in his outlaw gear, which meant that he had guns and everything else attached to his costume. They gave him a breathalyzer test, and the amount of alcohol in his body, they pronounced him legally and clinically dead. And he was thrown into jail, and the next day he was taken before the judge, who said that he was never legally allowed to drive a car in the state of Victoria, or never legally allowed ever again to be a passenger in a car in the state of Victoria. And he was driven to the airport, and that's how he left Australia at that time, which is a pretty good way to go, I reckon. So that's one of my favourite stories.
So they wrapped the film, and that
thankfully it happened on rap rather than on the first day.
On the day before.
The first day though, he was as soon as he arrived, he went down to Sydney and got thrown in jail for getting into fistfights. The producers had to bail him out of jail. Second day of the shoot. So yeah, it was they wanted an outlaw, and they got a genuine bona fide outlaw when they cast Dennis for that film.
So a little bit of method acting there.
The
Then.
the production manager says he was 39 when he was making the film, and no one ever thought that he would hit 40.
If you could define for me the term grindhouse and what it means to this movie.
Well, I'm not sure. Grindhouse, I guess, is an American expression that relates to the cinemas they were showing in, I assume. I'm never really been part of that culture, so I don't understand. We didn't have grindhouses in Australia. We had drive-in screens and just regular cinemas, and these films crossed over. They obviously, there was a huge drive-in market in Australia because Australians loved their cars, and we had good weather, so a lot of people were really interested in going to the drive-ins, and there was hundreds of them. So a lot of these films made their money just travelling from drive-in to drive-in, and occasionally they'd play in the city hardtops, the regular cinemas. But they didn't play. We didn't sort of have our flea pit sleazy 42nd Street cinemas, which I assume is what you guys refer to as grindhouse. Mm-hmm. But I guess the films are, in a way, very similar to your grindhouse films in the fact that they were down and dirty genre films, and these films were, basically the underbelly of the cultural films that we were sending out to the rest of the world, like Picnic at Hanging Rock and The Getting of Wisdom and My Brilliant Career. The films that people, respected from Australia. These were their,
Walkabout.
Yeah, Walkabout. These were the the uncle who turned up at Christmas and tell dirty jokes kinds of films. Yeah.
Drunken with his shirt off or pants down.
Yeah. Flushing the vicar.
Right. As they say, I guess. So, okay, definitely the drive-ins and where these movies were shown, or when they were imported to the grindhouse in America, maybe this place where you weren't necessarily going to see a quality film, but maybe just to be in a dark place.
What's interesting, Tarantino says in the documentary, he saw a lot of these films in grindhouses in America, and he didn't know they were Australian films until the actors opened their mouths. Right. They weren't. I mean, these films were. Whereas films like Picnic and Getting of Wisdom, Breaker Morant, My Brilliant Career, Walkabout, were sold as Australian films. Because Australia was a new. It was the flavour of the month then in terms of art house cinema. These films were just sold as genre films. That you were going to see a car chase film, or a biker film, or a werewolf film, or a vampire film, and they just happened to be made in Australia. You didn't realise that until, someone said g'day in them.
Throw a shimp on the bobby. So what happens is, you have, all these drive-in theaters, right? In America, we had them very popular as well. Australia, both car cultures, wide open spaces. Then home video comes along.
Sure.
And kind of takes the wind out of the sails for these type of genre films. I mean, do you think that there still is, exhibition for these? Are films like this still being made? How have the films changed, based on how the exhibition has changed, and how do you see exhibition going in the future?
Are you talking about in Australia or just in general?
In general.
Look, it's really difficult. People, when people have $16 to spend in going to see a film, and you want bang for your buck, and what are you going to do? You're going to go and see a low-budget film that basically your price of the ticket is paying for the film, or are you going to go and see that $180 million film that's showing in the cinema next to it? That's the problem. It's hard for these films to compete now in theatrical markets unless they're very, very smart and very, very good. And unfortunately, there's not a large percentage of them that are smart and good. And every so often, films do come out that are breakthroughs, like Let the Right One In, and like Splinter, and like there's been some really great English films like The Orphanage, that just that reinvent the genre again. There are always going to be kids who want to see nasty things done to people, so there's always going to be some kind of audience for your Lionsgate, let's get toenail clippers and pull that fingernail off kind of movie.
Yeah.
But, it's going to be harder for other smaller budget genre films, for sure. And, maybe their natural home is the Sci-Fi Channel or, Netflix or VOD or whatever.
Mm.
I guess you have to be aware of that when you're making them. I've been to markets and to the American film market and things like that, and you really it's an eye opener when you realise how much product is out there, and the people who are selling that product. It's not about the quality of it; it's about the quantity of it. It's about well, we need to fill these holes. We need to we need so many of these titles to to fill up our slots. It's not about what the quality's like of them. So it's interesting. It's all about the one sheet now, isn't it?
I mean, I guess so.
Because when you're in that video library, you haven't heard of half of these films that are on the shelf because they've just arrived, and it's whatever you see on that front cover.
Right. So I guess for my last question, you've got this documentary out. It's coming out tomorrow. It's a lot of fun, and
look, like I said before, we had a similar problem in Australia. This film went out wide in Australia. It went out on about 50 screens, which is pretty wide for an Australian film, let alone an Australian documentary. And when it screened last year, in the same cinemas, it was up against Tropic Thunder, Batman, and Iron Man, and you can't compete.
Sure.
And that's where we're lucky in Australia that we still have a large art house circuit, and that's where films like this can find audiences and can make money because they play forever.
So I guess my last question is, do you ever see yourself making a film like a Quentin Tarantino-esque film that maybe pays homage to these genre films, that is gang bang, rock'em sock'em, breasts flashing all over the screen? Would that be something you can see yourself doing in the future?
Sure. I'll leave my telephone number here if anyone's. Look, the thing that I liked about these films is that they were made for audiences. No matter what you think about them, they were there. They were made by people who loved films, and they were there to be watched by the widest possible audience. And they were always the kind of films that I wanted to make. They were the kind of films that I loved when I was a kid, and they're the kind of films that I still love. And making films shouldn't be. It should be a gigantic communal experience. It should be about getting your film to as many people as possible. And sure, that's very much what I'd like to do. Make films that find audiences, that people walk away and have enjoyed them and had some fun. And hopefully, in a very small documentary style way, that's what this film does.
Well, I definitely found it a lot of fun and very eye-opening, and I know that I'm going to be going on Netflix and watching a lot of these movies that I haven't seen before. The movie's Not Quite Hollywood, tells the story of the Ozploitation films. Director Mark Hartley, thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much.